Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special program organized by HJ International Graduate School for Peace and Public Leadership, until recently known as Unification Theological Seminary. My name is Stephen Boyd, and I'm the Dean of Enrollment Management and Student Life here at HJI. We're truly delighted that each of you can join us today from different parts of the United States and from around the world. Today, we are holding this program to commemorate Constitution Day. All institutions in the United States receiving federal funding, including funding through the U.S. Department of Education, are required to hold an educational program pertaining to the United States Constitution, and that normally will take place by mandate on September 17th of each year. If it falls on a Saturday, a Sunday, or a holiday, it may take place either before or after this date. And since this year, September 17th fell on a Sunday, HCI is commemorating the Constitution today, September 28th, 2023. And this day commemorates the September 17th, 1787 signing of the United States Constitution. So we look forward to sharing this experience with you. Before we begin our program, just a couple of housekeeping items. Everyone now understands the format of these programs. At any time during the event, this program, first of all, is being held in webinar form. And so there is a Q&A feature available that you can enter your questions at any time. And during our Q&A portion of the program, we'll do our very best to address all the questions that you have. As Dean of Enrollment Management here at HJI, I also will provide you with my contact information and important links about our programs of study here at the graduate school for anyone who may be interested in learning more about them and perhaps even studying with us. So to begin our program today, I would like to introduce Dr. Thomas J. Ward. Dr. Ward is the provost at HJ International Graduate School for Peace and Public Leadership. He is also a professor of Peace and Development, and he is the chair of the Master of Arts program in Peace Studies. His work on peace and development studies has been published in several major journals, including Paragon House and the London publishing firm E International Relations. Dr. Ward has been a recognized professional educator for more than 4 decades. He was vice president at the University of Bridgeport and is the founding dean of the College of Public and International Affairs at UB. In addition, he has been a Fulbright Scholar in France, a Foreign Ministry Research Fellow in Taiwan, a guest lecturer at the Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, and also at the National Academy of Political and Strategic Studies in Santiago, Chile. So let's welcome Dr. Ward. Dr. Ward.
Thank you very much, Dean Boyd, and greetings and thanks to all of you who join us on this special day when we commemorate the United States Constitution. You know, there are many countries around the world that have laws and constitutions. But one of the ways in which the United States distinguished itself from the very inception was that it did not just have law, but it had rule of law. And one could have confidence that what was written in that document was actually the basis upon which they would be judged as they went through the journey of their lives. And our Constitution, as all of you are well aware, has been has played a major role in the world for has played a major role, been a model for many nations around the world as they went through the process of nation building. And we really feel privileged this afternoon to be able to listen to Dr. Thomas Walsh. The United States Constitution did not just influence many nations around the world, but it also had a profound impact upon the United Nations itself and the founding of the United Nations, and had a great impact upon the United Nations Charter. Dr. Walsh has been involved for more than 3 decades with the United Nations. And he has attended a variety of events. He has engaged and interfaced with a number of the secretaries general and likewise with other presidents of the General Assembly and other key officials in the United Nations for many, many years. He really is an expert on the day-to-day workings of the United Nations. Trained at Vanderbilt University, where he earned his PhD in ethics, also so closely, a theme so closely tied to law and constitutional law. Dr. Walsh is also a proud alumnus of HJI. And for so many years in his life, he worked very, very closely both with the founder of HJI, Dr. Sun Myung Moon, and Dr. Hak Ja Han Moon, who both incidentally also had a great deal of respect and admiration for the United States Constitution and for the United Nations as an institution. And on so many occasions, I know that Dr. Walsh was directly involved with them in efforts in outreach and collaboration with the UN, and also in so many efforts in order to collaborate with the United States and key figures within the United States government, including Senator Orrin Hatch, such a champion of the United States Constitution. So we are really having an opportunity today to hear from an expert, a person who knows the United States Constitution, a person who knows the United Nations, and a person who has also collaborated with some of the key figures in modern times with those institutions and the documents that serve as their guiding foundations. And I really want to invite all of you to join me in greeting the president of HJI Graduate School for Peace and Public Leadership and our lecturer today, Dr. Thomas G. Walsh. Dr. Walsh, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Ward, for that very generous introduction, and I'll do my best to live up to it. And I really appreciated your introduction, and indeed for you reminding us of, in fact, our duty to honor the Constitution as an academic accredited institution in the United States that does receive some federal funding. So thank you, and for giving me this opportunity, inviting me to speak, because I've actually learned a lot just preparing for this, as I have in having the opportunity as well to teach this semester a course on the United Nations, which you're going to get some of the content that I also have shared with my wonderful students here at HJI. So thank you, those that have made time to join today. I know it's approaching dinner time for many of you, at least here on the East Coast. And so I want to move straight away to first screen share, because I'm going to use a PowerPoint throughout. I hope everybody can see that okay. This topic, the U.S. Constitution and the UN Charter, similarities, differences, and their significance. Of course, as Dr. Ward said eloquently, that our founders of HJI and of Family Federation, of Universal Peace Federation, spent 40 plus years in their ministry in the United States because they valued the importance of America and its Constitution, its democracy, and its religious freedom. And of course, always appreciated the United Nations. It was responsible for the liberation of Korea and making it possible for Father and Mother Moon to carry out their ministry. So a dual love that was very evident. Here is pictured the Washington Monument. Here also is the inaugural assembly of the Universal Peace Federation in 2005, and a speech that Father and Mother Moon, they both spoke at the United Nations at this time on the eve of the Millennium General Assembly at the United Nations. And as many of you know, they've spoken multiple times at the UN in New York, as well as in Geneva, and in Vienna at the UN headquarters. Why is this topic important? Well, as citizens, we have a responsibility to understand our history, our constitution, our form of government. Also, as Dr. Ward said, America, with its constitution, has set the standard and provided a model in the 18th century for the modern nation state. So the U.S. Constitution became the go-to document for most modern democratic nation states as they developed written constitutions, not only in the late 18th century, but throughout the 19th century, where independence movements were emerging, but in many nations in the 20th century that came out of the colonial era and decolonization took place, that the U.S. Constitution became a guiding document for them. The UN, arguably the League of Nations, were spearheaded in significant ways by U.S. presidents. Their leadership was essential. The UN is the world's primary intergovernmental organization, and its charter is the treaty that the member states, including the United States, ratified and agreed to abide by. I note that freedom of religion is essential for peace, and both the USA and UN underscore its importance. And if we want to change the world, make it better, the more we learn about many things, but I think also learning about the Constitution of the United States and Charter, which are kind of like the roadmap for both America and the United Nations. Why is this topic important? A couple of things. The tension between national identity or nationalism on the one hand and transnationalism or globalism on the other hand is a very significant issue in today's world. We know we have nationalist and populist movements, and we have those that are aspiring strongly for a more transnational, more globalized world. Additionally, some now argue that not only America, but the modern liberal democratic nation state system, the so-called West, which has had the United States as its leader in many respects, is in decline this time due to transnational globalization on the one hand and due to the advance of competing systems on the other hand. The Western USA paradigm that has its foundation in the Constitution, that paradigm for global order, democracy, and the United Nations and the Bretton Woods Institution is being challenged by, we hear of the BRICS, an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and more recently Saudi Arabia. And to some extent, the global South and some more authoritarian forms of governance, albeit they may describe themselves as democracies. So a new world order may be coming. What will it be like? And the significance of what happens and unfolds in the United Nations, even in the next election or beyond, and the United Nations, which is really suffering because it's kind of falling behind in the effort to address climate change, which was a central goal of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and in its inability to prevent what's happening in Ukraine from happening. So how did the U.S. Constitution, what developed? Well, there were contextual issues, and I think we have to point to the religious dimension of the Constitution. As John Adams said, the Revolutionary War was affected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. So there was a period beginning in the 1720s and 30s where revivalism, millennialism, even viewing this as the time of the second coming, pietism, and a shift away from established religion was taking place, setting the stage for the independence movement. The colonies at that time were under British rule by the Crown, the King, the Parliament in England, and appointed governors. There was, as the nation began to build this consensus toward independence, a Continental Congress established as a provisional government, and state constitutions. Before the national level constitution, many of the colonies or states developed their own constitutions that were precursors to the U.S. Constitution. In 1776, the Declaration, Independence, and from 77 to 81, the Articles of Confederation were a kind of provisional constitution, which at that time gave more sovereignty and independence to the states. So the Constitutional Convention was called in 1987, and ostensibly to amend the Articles of Confederation, which shifted as they gathered in Philadelphia toward a drafting of something more, a stronger constitution that was more federalist in nature. So that convention from May through September, initially to amend the articles, but it ended up replacing them in 89. The Constitution's ratified and the Bill of Rights ratified in 91. So there are many steps behind the progress of developing the Constitution. There's also these background issues of philosophical and religious theological ideas. The framers and the drafters of the Constitution were well educated in classical thought and Renaissance thought, and they studied Aristotle and Plato and the Roman system with its Senate. They knew of the Magna Carta, and visionaries like Hugo Grotius writing on toleration, on international society and rule of law. Sovereignty residing in the people became the concept, and he was influential in the eventual Peace of Westphalia, which established in many ways the foundations for eventually this current nation-state system that is spread all over the world. The Reformation, Luther and Calvin created a new way of envisioning the world spiritually, more individually, not needing to be necessarily a relationship to God requiring a structure or an authority above you, more freedom. Thomas Hobbes talked about the social contract, and people came together to accept a central government because the alternative was anarchy and insecurity. John Locke was very much in the minds of the framers, and the principle of consent of government. Montesquieu had written about the separation of powers, in executive, parliamentary, and judicial branches. Enlightenment thought in general, the Glorious Revolution in England and their Bill of Rights. This is a picture here of the painting of the Magna Carta and the Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Montesquieu pictures. The preamble of our Constitution, very brief, but it talks about a more perfect union, justice, domestic tranquility, common defense, general welfare, liberty. Many of these themes we find in the UN Charter as well. And its structure kind of proceeds in a very systematic, analytical way, one by one. It starts out talking about the Congress, and it will be a bicameral house, and it has the power to declare war. The Senate provides advice and consent to the executive. And the UN also created, instead of a Congress, it calls it a General Assembly. It's a kind of Congress or parliament made up of representatives of each nation state, as we'll see when we look at the UN Charter. The second section of the Constitution is about the executive branch of government. President is given power. He's a commander-in-chief and can make treaties with advice and consent of the Senate. We note that the UN has the Security Council as its kind of executive organ. And the P5 within that 15-member Security Council, the P5 is the term referring to Russia, China, the United States, France, and England, which have the veto power. They're the big five that, in an undemocratic way, they have authority greater than the others, which was a bargain that was necessary in order to get the United Nations Charter off the ground. But the P5, if you like, could be a kind of executive officer or commander-in-chief, but the UN lacks that position. It has a secretary general, but as is often said, the secretary general is more secretary than general, but with great diplomatic authority. Article 3 brings up the Supreme Court, the judicial branch that Montesquieu also talked about. The UN has the International Court of Justice. Article 4 deals more with states' rights and it guarantees the states that they will be assured a republican form of government and security. We note that the UN has member states, just as the Constitution refers to the states. But the UN does not have citizens as such. The citizens are of a particular state. The UN is not set up as a government. Each member state is independently sovereign in that sense. It has signed a treaty to work with the UN, but it is not under the UN in the way that Nebraska is under the federal government. Our Constitution talks about amendments. There have been 27 amendments. The UN also has amendments, but has been unable to really enact many amendments because the prospect of amending the charter, it is feared, will open up a widespread call for radical reform. That's my interpretation of that. Article 6 talks about the supreme law of the land being the Constitution and the federal laws. The UN does not quite have this authority, just as international law does not, of supreme law, and lacks the enforcement authority that a national government has. Article 7 was about ratification. So, some reflections just quickly. Crisis and response. The background of the UN Constitution was a revolutionary war, and the background of the UN Charter was World War II. So, in different ways, they came out of a war. The World War, of course, in magnitude much greater. And the Constitution, like the UN Charter, was drafted by the winners of the war. The UN Charter was drafted by the U.S. and the United Kingdom and the then USSR. And the USA moved from, under the Articles of Confederation, a league of friendly states who were in some form of alliance to a strong federal system with a central government that they eventually accepted. So they voluntarily came into this system of a central government. The UN does not serve as a world government for nation states. It's a league or an association of nations. The issue here to think about is a sovereign government like the United States versus what an intergovernmental organization. So the UN emerged from a league of nations, but when it was established, it did not become a central government. It is not a centralized controlling government. I asked the question here, what motivates independent nations or the original states or colonies to integrate, merge, or unify? Are there incentives financially? Makes trade easier? Or is it a fear of insecurity that the colonies would fight with one another. Or a large fear in the United States was that Britain would continue to interfere with the affairs of state and might find one of the 13 colonies or states that they could begin to manipulate or work with. So there was a sense of also fear of the European powers, particularly England. Or was it idealism? So these are issues that are kind of in the mind of the colonies and the states as they particularly are considering to ratify the Constitution. And you might ask yourself, and different theories have emerged about these types of motivations. The other question is, when we look at the UN and the USA, has to do with the kind of sense of common bond. I use the word solidarity here. You know, the nation state traditionally was a people who shared a common language, a kind of shared history, and often a shared culture and religion. They were kind of bonded together in that kind of communal type of relationship. Now, that is not the case any longer in the United States. We are a multicultural, diverse melting pot, so to speak. The UN didn't have that. It has nations with different forms of government, different cultures and languages and that. So it didn't quite have the bonds that, at least at the time of the Constitution, the United States had. So let me talk a little bit now about the UN Charter and some of its precursors.
Dr. Walsh, just as a reminder, we're about a little over 15 minutes into your talk, just to let you know the time.
All right, very good. Thank you, sir. One is the after the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, there was a Congress of Vienna that brought together the major powers, and they created a compact. There were peace conferences in the late 19th century in The Hague in the Netherlands. A big turning point was the establishment after World War I. After a horrific war, there was the emergence of the League of Nations, and a big influence was Woodrow Wilson, pictured here, whose 14 points, point 14 reads, "A general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence, territorial integrity to great and small states alike." So an association of nations. This was taken up at the Versailles Paris Peace Conference that resolved World War I. And they agreed to establish the League of Nations. Likewise, it was Franklin Roosevelt who's in many ways influenced the UN with the Four Freedoms speech. And as Wilson played a key role in the League, Roosevelt and American leadership was essential to the forming of the UN. This is Roosevelt with at the Paris Peace Conference with the British President Prime Minister Lloyd George, the Italian Premier Orlando, and French Premier Georges Clemenceau. And they had to develop the covenant of the League of Nations. Here on this slide, I can't go into it, but this was hotly debated in the United States. There was a debate in Boston in the Symphony Hall in 1919 between Henry Cabot Lodge and Lawrence Lowell. Cabot Lodge, a senator, and Lowell, the president of Harvard. And they took the side, one affirming the League and the other not. And if you oppose the League of Nations, you go back to Washington. You say, he warned us about entangling alliances, etc. So eventually the Senate did reject the Versailles Peace Conference and the League Covenant. And the big issue was sovereignty. Will we be surrendering sovereignty as the United States if we join this league? And would we weaken the then existing Monroe Doctrine. Wilson was to kind of open and preside, or kind of open up the session of the League, but he did not go because he did not have the support of the United States. So the League precursored the UN. It had an assembly, a council, and a court. So the UN Charter didn't just emerge out of nowhere. Just as the U.S. Constitution had the state constitutions to look at and the Articles of Confederation to look at, the UN drafters had the League of Nations Covenant to look at. And if you compare them, and I don't have time, you'll find so many similarities. So although the League was viewed as a kind of failure, it could not prevent Japan and Germany and Italy from aggressive actions during the 30s. And it became irrelevant, almost comparable to the situation of Ukraine today. The League talked about humanitarian issues. What's interesting to note about the United Nations Charter is the idea of the Charter began to develop very early on, in the midst of World War II. They were already planning the post-World War II era, and having a strengthened kind of, the League would be abandoned and a new entity would be put in place. And there were precursors to that. The UN was a name that the Allied powers who worked to defeat Hitler and Japan were already called United Nations. That was coined by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And there were a series of meetings. One, the Atlantic Charter, where Roosevelt and Churchill met on the HMS Prince of Wales, a ship in the North Atlantic off Newfoundland, when ships were being targeted by the Germans and sunk. And they first sketched the charter. There was a declaration put out in January 1st, 1942, called Declaration by United Nations, and a series of conferences that took place, including the Dunbarton Oaks and Bretton Woods conferences, Yalta, and eventually the San Francisco conference, where the charter was drafted. These are photos. This is from the HMS Prince of Wales with Wilson and Churchill. This is from Dunbarton Oaks. Here is Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill in Yalta. Here is the signing of the UN Declaration. And this is the Bretton Woods. This in the center, that's John Maynard Keynes, who's a famous economist who was influential in setting up the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. And the charter, well, here's Truman. Roosevelt died just days before the charter was finalized. And here it is reported in the New York Herald Tribune. Photos from San Francisco. The charter has some similarity to, as I said, the preamble of the U.S. Constitution and the League of Nations, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. So going through, you have in the UN Charter, Chapter 1, its purposes and principles. Chapter 2 is about membership. Then it goes through, it says there will be these 6 organs: General Assembly, Security Council, Economic and Social Council, Trusteeship Council, International Court of Justice, Secretariat. And then it goes virtually one by one through these, sets up its General Assembly, its Security Council, which is the more executive body with the permanent 5 members with the veto power, and greatest authority. It talks about peaceful resolution of disputes in Chapter 6, but in Chapter 7, empowers the Security Council to take action when there are breaches of peace and acts of aggression, but it doesn't always act swiftly or even at all. It does affirm the reliance on regional arrangements like the African Union or the ASEAN or the EU. It then goes into the work of the Economic and Social Council, talks about non-self-governing territories, so it set up the trusteeship system and the trusteeship council, its court of justice, its secretariat, and the secretary general. It does have a way to make amendments, but there have only been 5 or 6 amendments throughout its history, and they've all been related to increasing the numbers of the Security Council or the ECOSOC, not substantial overhaul. Religion has played a role in the framers and the founders. We know that the Declaration, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with unalienable rights. The First Amendment affirms freedom of religion. Franklin and the framers, and a quote from Ronald Reagan, Washington, and Adams. These are quotes affirming the significance and importance of religion, and Jefferson. Here's on the HMS Prince of Wales, you have Roosevelt and Churchill, and here's a quote from Churchill. They had a church service together. I chose the hymns myself, Churchill says. And one song is for those in peril on the sea, and the other, onward Christian soldiers. We ended with, O God, our help in ages past. Every word seemed to stir the heart. It was a great hour to live. Nearly half of those who sang were soon to die. So again, this is reflecting back on 1941. D-Day is 3 years away. This is Franklin Roosevelt's D-Day prayer. I can't read it, but it's a moving and profound prayer as the troops were landing on Normandy. President Truman talks about the significance, because he had to step in the presidency when Roosevelt died, and one of his first acts was to go to San Francisco for the signing of the charter. And he talked about the significance of it globally. He praised Wilson, his role in the League of Nations. He praised Roosevelt. He said, let us not fail to grasp this supreme chance to establish a worldwide rule of reason to create an enduring peace under the guidance of God. Here's Truman pictured with some of the soldiers. He used to keep a copy of a poem by Alfred Tennyson called Locksley Hall, which talked about creating, eventually, after the wars have stopped, a federation of the world, a parliament of man that's lapped in universal law. So somehow that was always with him. So he ended up in this significant position. At the same time, we've got Stalin. The Bolshevik Revolution happening concurrent with World War I. And then you have Stalin and his antipathy to religion. And yet, in order to create this United Nations, it was felt by Roosevelt and Churchill that Stalin had to be on board. UN Charter does speak about religious freedom. Eleanor Roosevelt led the drafting committee to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Article 18 is strongly on the topic of freedom of religion. So religion has played a factor. The UN, even today, you have 2 Secretaries General, Dag Hammarskjöld, a very spiritual man who was very much dedicated to developing the meditation room, which is at the UN headquarters in New York. And this is U Thant, from Myanmar now, a Buddhist monk. He used to lead meditations at the United Nations. There's a church center for the religious NGOs, a committee of religious NGOs. The Alliance of Civilizations was set up to bring different religious and cultural perspectives to bear on UN issues, and at World Interfaith Harmony Week. There are religious NGOs at the UN, many here. They were there in San Francisco. And of course, our founders, as Dr. Ward said, desired to create an interreligious council at the United Nations and talked about we need to move from what they refer to as a Cain UN to an Abel UN. We needed the spiritual and we needed the focus on God. I realize my time is running out, and I think there'll be some time in the Q&A to talk a little bit. This was just an article in recent Wall Street Journal by Walter Russell Mead, just the heading. This was 2 days ago because the General Assembly's been meeting. World disorder is spreading fast. Here's a readout. The Western rules-based system hasn't been threatened since the 1930s. That's leading up to World War II. And that's what people are worried about right now. Closing thoughts and questions. Can there be a world constitution? Should there be? Will or should nation states surrender sovereignty to a world government? What kind of world government? How can transnational challenges be resolved without a central power, or what Hobbes would call the leviathan of a centralized state with the powers of coercion, as political scientists and sociologists refer to the nation state? Can collective security work amidst a Cold War? In the UN, in America, we all know the Democrats and Republicans are totally divided, right? Polarized. UN, you have something similar, and it's similar in a Cold War, that they're each working to outmaneuver the other. What about nationalism? There are many movements towards the EU being the prime example to try to have a transnational or post-national constellation that works. And there was talk about, the African Union moving more toward that kind of system, or these other and you have the G7 and G20 and these kinds of associations. So these are questions that many are asking at this time. So I'm Dr. Ward, Dean Boyd. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your patience, and I know we went through a lot, and I think it's good to open up for this question and answer.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Dr. Walsh, for really an outstanding presentation. You really covered such important territory, everything from the intent behind these two founding documents, both the United States Constitution and also the United Nations Charter, and also the structures that resulted based upon those two fundamental documents. You also outlined some of the key players that result and the roles that they play based upon those documents, and also the issues that we face as a nation and that we also face as a community of nations in terms of the relationships that exist amongst us. If you don't mind, I'm going to kind of take advantage of my role maybe and start by raising a couple of questions, and I'd really appreciate your insights on these things, because I know you've been dealing with them for such a long period of time, and you know the power that nation states have at the UN. I'm just reflecting on the founding of the U.S. Constitution. Certainly one of the key roles in the U.S. Constitution, one of the key developments was the so-called Connecticut Compromise, whereby it became possible that a union could be formed because there would be representation in two houses. one of which was the House of Representatives, and it would be based upon the population of each of the states. And the second would be the U.S. Constitution, where the states would be representative states, irregardless of the size of their population or anything. They would each have 2 representatives. You pointed to the problem of the Security Council. The Security Council was set up with the Permanent Five, and we know that the world has changed so dramatically since that time. I mean, in reality, 2 of the P5 nations, Russia and France, already in terms of population, obviously, in terms of size of the economy, in terms of military impact, both of these nations, in many respects, or at least in one or more of each of those areas, not all of them, but in one of each of those categories, they are far outpaced by India. And yet the prospects of India ever having a seat at the United Nations, it's going to be, as you said, it may be a whole, really many hurdles to cross for something like that to happen. So I'm just wondering, how do you see navigating this time in the United Nations, when we can imagine that there are going to be more and more clamors of dissatisfaction, clamors about inequality, injustice, and also a constitution which protects a status quo which is no longer a valid one? How would you? I'd appreciate your thoughts on this, because you.
Well, thank you for that, and for kind of framing the question. That is really one of the main questions that people are asking. Has it become irrelevant because the UN is kind of locked into this Security Council system, and it was a bargain from the beginning. I think Churchill was very suspicious of Stalin, and getting into bed with the USSR, but Roosevelt, I think, felt this thing won't work. The League failed because Germany withdrew, Japan withdrew, the United States didn't get on board, and they saw without the U.S. leadership or getting even the difficult nations on board, it becomes just a kind of regional alliance, or it becomes a league of a certain type of nation rather than more universal. And the UN and the vision that I think Roosevelt very much had, and those around him, was for something universal, all include. All the nations would eventually, although they started out with the 50 or so in San Francisco that had been allies in World War II. And you're exactly right. Those 5 nations, and 2 of them from Europe, and then the United States, and then you have what was then the USSR, and early on the Republic of China, now People's Republic of China. And there's a article in the charter, as you know, that said there should be after 10 years there should be a review of the charter and look into adjustments that would need to be tweaked. And yet there's been great hesitation that if we do anything other than we're going to increase the size of the Economic and Social Council from 27 states to 54, or we're going to allow more non-permanent members on the Security Council from 9 to 15. These are the kinds of very, very incremental, but a larger one, maybe fear what happened with the U.S. Constitution. At least I read, you had the Articles of Confederation, and you're thinking you're just going to tweak those, but you end up with a new constitution that was much stronger and different. So, and then what can happen is you'll get the withdrawal of nation. The problem that the League had people opt out, even though they might have signed on the treaty. As we see, sovereignty trumps multilateralism if push comes to shove. And even the people of the nation say, we don't want our government to go along with that system. But I don't know what it will be because, as you pointed out, there was this recent BRICS meeting, and it's more and more that China, Russia, North Korea, of course, Iran, some others are clearly see the Western kind of dominate, because it is true. The United Nations, it's in New York. The charter was in San Francisco. Everybody knows the U.S. led the victory of World War II primarily, its strength in coming in there. And it kind of had the prerogative to kind of lead the way. And Roosevelt had the vision at that time. And whether that model can endure is a question. People are looking at the United States. You get people that feel deeply discouraged and depressed about the current state of the United States, despite its constitution, because it's not only documents, it's what's the real character and heart and spirit of the people and its leadership. You have, as I watched some of the Republican debate the other night, many people were kind of saying, where's Ronald Reagan? Because it took place because they, loved Ronald Reagan. And so there's concern not only about the United Nations, but also the United States. So I didn't really have an answer. Everybody's kind of thinking whether shouldn't Japan join? They donate so much to the UN, or Nigeria or South Africa. And I think, whether things will unravel if there was kind of a charter convention. If you look at the way the Sustainable Development Goals are kind of put together and these others, they're done more inclusively and democratically, but often as inclusive and democratic as they appear from a certain way, they're also insiders that are really shaping the documents so that it's hard for any institution to be 1,000% democratic, where every person has a voice and a vote on every sentence.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walsh. That's a masterful approach of the kind of challenges that are out there that need to be addressed in terms of this incredibly challenging environment that we find ourselves in.
Absolutely.
This is I'm going to try to take an issue that's raised here by Philip Soyvan and try to represent it and ask you if you could be able to maybe to address this and how you see it being addressed, both in the terms of the United States and in the case of the United Nations. That is these two pursuits, the pursuit of freedom and the pursuit of equality. And many times these two pursuits, they seem to conflict with each other, and they impact on each other in very clear and contradicting ways. I'm just wondering, how do you see a way in which to somehow address those in a more harmonious way, or which of the two is more important, or how do we prioritize? Any thoughts that you would have on this?
It's another great question. Thank you, Philip, and thank you for framing it, Dr. Ward. Yeah, it really is. In some ways, it is the core of even the split of the Cold War and of the human rights movement. That the Cold War, you have the free market. It's liberty oriented. It says create this level playing field and let people free to be entrepreneurial, to work hard or not work hard, give them the freedom, but that we don't have to tinker with the outcomes. They will take care of themselves in a way. And this is simplified, but the equality emphasis of the anti-capitalist or more socialist or welfare state democracy systems, that equality became much more of a priority. And equality requires hands-on enforcement. It ultimately comes down to a form of necessary coercion for what is perceived to be a worthy outcome. And so the state needs to intervene to redistribute things so that people get their fair share. Now, John Rawls, this famous philosopher and ethicist who wrote Theory of Justice and many other books, tried to work out a theory of justice that would allow freedom, but a certain moderation of freedom, that at some point you were free to benefit greatly, but it had to in some ways be of some benefit to the least advantaged. That was his difference principle, and believed that in an original social contract, people would all support that. So it's not easy. It's at the core of the Cold War, as I said, and of debates over human rights, and even in the political parties here. You could say, generally speaking, again, Republicans' freedom is what's critical. Allow people to be free and rely on virtue and charity and philanthropy to redistribute. Again, maybe a caricature, but simply. And then you have the Democratic Party is more distributionist with equality, or today we talk about equity, was a term that, because people understood that equality is impossible. You can't make sure everybody's exactly as intelligent, as exactly effective in their work, has to get the same rewards as everyone else, and you have to watch everything so nobody has a reward. And then the principle starts to emerge that any inequality the only explanation for any inequality, if I have a nicer suit than you, is rooted in an injustice. That somehow the only explanation is there's an injustice, because somehow there's two differences, and you have that nicer suit than I do, or I have. So it's not easy. So that's what religion tries to do. That's what you could say. It's a Cain-Abel kind of struggle. And how do you unify? How do you balance them? How does love enter in? The principle of true love, which can also include tough love. And it doesn't mean just give people whatever they clamor for, but it takes wisdom. It takes a virtue. And if, as many great thinkers have said, we can have great ideas and great theories and great constitutions, but if we have people that are corrupt and have become decadent and then the system's not going to work. So,
thank you. Yeah, I hear you, and I think particularly what you just said about love and the role of true love. I remember once Father Moon saying, if you actually have true love, then you don't need justice; it's automatic. So yeah. I think that is the key role of religion is fostering that the appreciation of and the need of cultivation of love.
Yeah.
Here's a tough question for you, Dr. Walsh, from one of our professors at HJI, Dr. Ron Brown. He says the three constitutions you stress, the American Constitution, the League of Nations, and the UN Charter, were all the results of wars and written by the victors. Will we need another world war for a new global constitution?
That's my worry, Dr. Brown. We tend to respond to crisis, and even when we come together, and this was Thomas Hobbes. You could call him a pessimist or whatever, but it was that without a strong central authority, we don't end up just loving one another and being together. We form smaller tribes and groups, small units of solidarity, and historically, people have preyed upon the other, taken advantage of them. So in order to establish security, you agreed to a central government in order to police and create domestic tranquility. and to prevent invasion from outside the borders. That's a core principle of why nation states are formed. And indeed, the League and the United Nations were, the thought of Kant, and that was in many ways idealistic, and it was coming out of the aftermath of the French Revolution and noting the American Revolution. And these ideas were in the Enlightenment. But indeed, what got people to, in a sense, wake up, and it was the victors. It was those that had power. And in some sense, it took a kind of a hegemonic power to have the authority to pull it together, even the economic resources that were required. Probably no one else than the U.S. at that time could have pulled it together. Will China put together the next UN? Will there be some horrific war that people are worried about? Ukraine and Taiwan are two of the major areas of concern, and they're concerned to all of us. And we are in Cold War 2.0. And thank you, Dr. Brown.
Yeah, anyway, and thank you for addressing that in such a profound way, Dr. Walsh. I'm glad that you see that as a serious question, and that unfortunately that it sometimes takes that type of thing to bring about a real change. Yeah. I see an interesting question here, actually, from one of my former University of Bridgeport students, who is now, I believe, a PhD or soon to be a PhD student to complete her PhD at George Mason University, Valentina Gelosi. Valentina, nice to hear from you. She asked a very profound question. She asked, is the making of a constitution traditionally peace-driven, or is it war-driven? And she says, are there differences between constitutions that result from being either peace-driven or war-driven? How do you see that?
Well, yeah, again, a great question, and many of these have this theme that is at the heart, and I kind of asked myself, what drove the 13 colonies or the 13 fledgling states to decide to merge? And they had just gone through war, but prior to that, there was this move toward independence, of not wanting to be controlled by the British, and unhappy with the way they were being taxed and unrepresented, and this spread. So there was a constitution was related that if they were going to declare independence and set up a provisional government, then they were kind of ready. It was kind of like a certain way, a war of national liberation, and this also began to spread in the 18th century. And so on the one hand, the Constitution was kind of in the case of the United States, a kind of declaration of war related to, we are separating, we are declaring independence. We know we're ready to fight for it. And, but we're serious about it, and we're going ahead and establishing our government, and are based on a constitution. And they created the first written constitution of the modern state that's the longest standing. So the war was fought before the Constitution was finally finalized and ratified. So it was shaped by war, and I think the coming together of those colonies in a stronger union, I personally believe, was driven by fear. I don't mean cowardice. Fear is legitimate. Many of Many people lock their car door, for example, or they lock their house, or they're careful where they walk. That's not an illegitimate cowardice. That is kind of experience-based caution of knowing some very, very dangerous aspects of human nature. So I think constitutions have an idealism. You could say maybe this, to summarize, just there's hope and optimism. And there's also, it's like a doctrine of creation and restoration, but a strong doctrine of the fall. And particularly coming out of World War I, World War II, these were unbelievably horrible and miserable, wretched, the worst kinds of wars. So maybe we can conclude that it's some of both. It's a hope for the future and a better world, and it's fear, knowing from experience, wow, human beings are really capable of monstrous acts toward each other. And the hate and resentment that can spiral out of control can be very real. And how do we protect ourselves from it?
Are we okay for one or two more questions, Dr. Walsh? Is that okay?
For me, I'm fine.
Okay. All right. There's a question here to you from Susan Evans. She says, as you mentioned, Father Moon had great respect for the United Nations. Could you please explain why it is that he formed UPF as laid out in the inaugural speech of 2006?
Well, I'll say a little bit. Thank you, Susan. It was fascinating, the kind of, even looking at the history of the various organizations that True Parents founded, and starting in the around 1990, and this was at the time when Mother Moon went to Moscow. They met Gorbachev. The USSR was, and this was almost like a time of great opportunity, as was the year 2000, the millennium. There was tremendous hope. And indeed, at that time, there was a huge religious summit at the UN in the year 2000. But he created two organizations in 1990. It was initially called the International Federation for World Peace and the Interreligious Federation for World Peace. That was 1990. And by 1999, some 9 years later, he in effect kind of created a merger of those two, that you could kind of view that the primary ways in which world affairs are organized, or global society is organized, apart from the private sector of home and family and private life, are by nation states, governments, and religion. Simplification, but the two largest kind of ways in which we organize. And so he created the International Federation World and the Interreligious Federation, merged them. And with that merger was a call for the UN to merge. There was even an organization, in terms of ideas, called United Religions Initiative, where visionaries were saying we should have an organization comparable, or like a sibling organization, United Nations and United Religions, to represent these two spheres. So Father Mother talked about and gave this speech at the UN in 2000, August 18th, that said, let's create a truly bicameral system, even with the religious in a kind of Senate or House of Lords type position, almost like the wise elders, those that weren't just currying favor or votes, but could focus on principle and ethic and purposes and the best overall outcomes. So I think that was the vision of the concept of an able like UN, and it needed that spiritual not that religion is so pure always. In many ways, just as governments and political leaders are corrupt, we also know that religions can be pretty nasty and they can do not nice things. But in principle, this ideal of religion can be the kind of portal through which God's word can come to humanity, and that should be expressed at the United Nations. That was the vision, and then UPF was, UPF. The inauguration was 2005, but we simply changed the name of what was called the Interreligious and International Federation for World Peace. Had already been given consultative status at the UN. That name was changed in 2005. But that's a little bit of background. And through that, if we had been able to succeed in establishing an interreligious council, in many ways the UN did make many accommodations to religion. It did set up this agency called the Dialogue Among Civilizations, Alliance of Civilizations. The General Assembly approved the World Interfaith Harmony Week. There's much greater receptivity to the voices of religious leaders. They're there, many religious leaders, for example, at these climate change conferences or conferences about human rights or disarmament or any number of UN issues. Much more accommodating. And globally, people have been increasingly aware that we'll not achieve peace through political or negotiation or through military means alone, without also including other partners, most especially bringing peace among religions and religions being able to be partners with the UN in forging a path to peace.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh. I think we need to move pretty close to the end of our program. You've shared an awful lot, and there are lots and lots of further questions. Maybe I can discuss with you later about how we might be able to address the questions that we're not able to address during this session. But anyway, thank you very much, Dr. Walsh. I'd like to maybe just close with one final question. I'd really like to invite your reflection upon that. And if we look at the United States Constitution, and we also consider the UN Charter, and specifically if we look at the preambles of both of these documents, we see that the United States Constitution talks about securing the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, and we see that the United Nations preamble talks about preventing the scourge of wars for future generations. So the amazing thing is that the drafters of both of these documents, they were clearly not just thinking about themselves, but they were thinking about the future, thinking about future generations. Oh. Do you think that is still a reality? And if not, how do we reawaken that, and how do we foster that ability to look beyond the immediate into the future in terms of going forward as a country, and likewise as a community of nations?
Oh, I think that's excellent question, excellent comment, and the Charter saves succeeding generations from the scourge of war, and succeeding generations. And I think we do still find that language and rhetoric, for example, with climate change, that we have to do this because of our children's children. And so that is there, or we need to prevent World War III because of that. So I think there is still that concept, but I fear that in many ways there is this sense, particularly in the generally Judeo-Christian West, that we see some reports that people are much less actively engaged with religion, some decline in traditional denominationalism, for example. They may be shifting to more evangelical or Pentecostal forms of spirituality, or many talk about Christianity is the modern European Western world is secularizing more and more, and especially younger generations, but that the global South, you're still seeing in Africa, parts of Latin America, parts of Asia, that there's a resurgence of religion. Whether that can happen in a very good way. Some people see resurgences of religion as a resurgence of kind of narrow and more vulgar theocratic aspiration in some of the religions, and worry about religious resurgence. But and this is what's I think so powerful and important about Reverend and Mrs. Moon, who had this globally urbane and sophisticated sense of bringing people together and having a deep rooted spirituality, but which is broad and embracing, and even seeing that politically. How do we find a way to meet with Kim Il-sung, as Reverend Mrs. Moon did? And so many of the conferences that we organized and you organized, you're not only trying to bring only the right wing, but you're trying to also bring them both together and dialogue and move forward. So I think it has a lot to do also with the family. If the family we're dealing with depopulation now, as hard as that to be. When I was a college student, the greatest scare, or the planet was going to be destroyed in 10 years because of overpopulation. But now the trends, as reported in the New York Times just a week or so ago, radical depopulation. Korea itself is radically declining in its birth rate. Fertility rates are down. Japan, Western Europe, Russia, many nations are declining, even slowing in so-called developing countries. China had its one-child policy, and it's hard to reverse it. So we are going into depopulation and people not wanting to marry, not wanting to have children. People have dogs today. Nothing wrong with dogs, but it's serious. And so if we need to find some new model of revived spirituality that builds on the foundation of the past. And our religions are really struggling. The culture wars are there. In the Catholic Church, this synodality movement that Pope Francis supports, but you're getting it taken in very radical directions that are some predicting schism within the Catholic Church, which has held together so many years. So I think it's a crisis of religion too. It's not just religion is coming in the white horse to save everybody. Religion also needs to save itself, and just as governments do and societies do. And this is our heartache, and I know it's Mother Moon's heartache at this time. How does she reach the world, and how can this message? Because many times the medicine that's needed is viewed as something diabolical and pernicious and needs to be eradicated. And the attacks on new religious movements, as you, Dr. Ward, have told us many times, is so horrific. So we've got a lot of work to do. Still hopeful, and I think these kinds of programs can help us a lot to make a difference in this world. And so I thank everyone for being here and listening to me talk so much. And for those of you involved with HGAI and our wider movement, I thank you for that too, because I think we have a lot to contribute to this world, as difficult as it is. Thank you, Dr. Ward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walsh. We really appreciate your presentation again. You helped us all to reflect upon and appreciate the framers of those documents, the implications of those documents, and likewise to reflect upon the fact that we find ourselves at a point in history where we need to think big, wide, deep, and long, have a far range projection, not just live for the moment. So I thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Walsh. I thank everyone who's joined us, and I'd like to turn things back over to Dean Stephen Boyd. Dean Boyd?
Thank you very much, Dr. Walsh, Dr. Ward. I think all of us who were in attendance tonight have really experienced directly the value that the work that our true parents are doing as exemplified through both of you. Dr. Walsh, thank you for a masterful presentation and very insightful responses to critical questions of our time. And thank you, Dr. Ward, for acting as our host tonight. Again, a masterful job. And as host, sometimes you're not in a position to respond in the way that you could do based upon your vast experience and knowledge. But thank you for taking this role tonight and framing the questions in such a thoughtful, meaningful way, which would allow Dr. Walsh to respond, I think, to the satisfaction of everyone on the call. Dr. Walsh, Dr. Ward, nobody dropped off tonight. Everybody remained, even though we passed the hour by quite a few minutes. I don't think anybody minded. Again, and also this presentation tonight is an example, and it points to the value of HJI as an institution. The course materials, the degree programs offered here are extremely meaningful. They go beyond a superficial understanding of the subject. It's not a series of talking points that people often use in their daily conversation. This is an in-depth understanding and perspective, which allows you to really be a protagonist in world affairs, national and world affairs, both on the religious level and in this case in the area of peace and reconciliation. So thank you both for coming, and thank you to all of our attendees tonight for staying on the call. A recording of this event will be available. It'll be up probably in the next few days on the website. You'll see it posted in the appropriate location on the image for this particular program tonight. And we want to invite you back next week, next Thursday, October 5th at 7 p.m. this time. We will be having the first of our regular series of faculty roundtables that are presented in the fall and the spring semesters. And next week, the roles will be switched. We will have Dr. Walsh as our host and Dr. Ward as our central presenter. His topic is an interesting topic. I think none of you want to miss this. The life, beliefs, and dreams of China's President Xi Jinping. It's going to be a very enlightening presentation. We invite you to come. Please be on the lookout for an email in your inbox, and we welcome your registration. Thank you all for coming. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you, Dr. Walsh, Dr. Ward again, and thank you everyone participating. Thank you, Angelica, behind the scenes for making this work so massively technically. And we look forward to our next time. Thanks so much, and God bless.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dean Boyd. Thank you, Dr. Ward. Great,
Walsh.
masterful hosting.
Good night, everyone.
Easy to do with the magisterial presenter. No problem.
All right, let's stay in touch. Thank you.